Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Ali Hashmi Raddaoui. I'm a former professor of applied linguistics at the College of Letters and Humanities at the University of Sfax. And currently, I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics. I'm also the Arabic program director at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. I'd like to start out by thanking the organizers of this conference, particularly Zainab Daimighriani, for this opportunity to speak with colleagues, many of whom I have known for a long time and whose friendship and collegiality I deeply appreciate and value. I wish to congratulate Zainab Daimighriani on fulfilling the requirements for the PhD degree just yesterday. Mabruk, Dr. Ghariani. The context of my talk is about situations where learners have firmly and fully acquired their native languages and are embarking on learning a foreign language or perhaps a second language. As you can see, the topic of my talk is language immersion in a technology-rich environment from theory to practice. And I must say that I'm still at the exploration stage and I do not have strong opinions about the issues discussed here. The goals of this paper are four. First of all, I'd like to bring back to the radar a time-tested approach to language learning and teaching, and that is immersion. Secondly, I'd like to attempt an initial stab on theorizing language immersion. And three, I wish to conduct a preliminary comparison between L1 acquisition on the one hand and language immersion on the other. Lastly, I like to imagine the configuration of a language immersion village or institute or camp in light of the prevalent ICT resources. At this point, it's important for me to make one or two disclaimers. The first is about what this paper is not concerned with. This paper is not an invitation to forego the learning, teaching, acquisition, and whatever you wish to call it, of the first language. This paper is thus not about the kind of bilingualism that gradually results in subtracting the first language out of the repertoire of the learner or the child. It is more interested in enriching the learner's repertoire and means of knowledge acquisition through another language and through what is commonly referred to in the literature as additive bilingualism. I'd like to talk a little bit about my credentials as well. And the first one has to do with my credentials vis-a-vis language immersion. To this end, I would like to say that I participated in the design and discussion of the structure of the Nabil Language Village in 2006-2007. Secondly, I also designed and implemented in full the curriculum of an Arabic language camp or village here at the University of Wyoming in the USA for the benefit of high school students. This was in 2011. I also led an English language internship for the benefit of the College of Letters and Humanities students in Derby in the UK in 2007. Acquisition-wise, I'm still at the level of language immersion. Personally, I have benefited by a year-long language immersion program back when I was a student at the École Normale Supérieure in Tunis. This was part of an agreement between the Ministry of Higher Education, Scientific Research and Technology, and what a friend of mine used to call the CBEVA, that is the Central Bureau for Educational Visits and Exchanges in the UK. I then spent a year as a French language assistant at high school and spent the rest of my time practicing English in its native environment. From the point of view of acquisition, I obviously acquired Arabic natively, but then, as a child, I was not investigating my practice. However, I have reared my children into their native language, Arabic, and was interested in their language development, and this is true for many of those who are attending this conference today. I have also watched and observed plenty of other experiences in acquisition. At this time, I would like to give you an idea, if I may, if technology does not, what's the problem here? Okay, let me stop recording. Well, at this time, I'd like to walk you through the steps of this presentation. I'd like to begin, first of all, by saying a few words about the goal of this presentation and the problematic that it is raising. I will then provide a definition for immersion, especially with reference to language immersion. And then perhaps the core of this presentation is about comparing the acquisition of the native language with language immersion environments. This will lead me naturally to discussing the shape of a language immersion institute that is enriched with information and communication technologies. Finally, I have a few words to say by way of a conclusion and an invitation for thinking about the implications of this research. Okay, well, I'm going to read out the executive summary in the interest of those who just wish to listen to that and to find out what the paper is about from the very beginning. So I'll just read this out. Notwithstanding the plethora of second and foreign language teaching theories and pedagogies, language immersion programs and practices remain under-theorized, though they noticeably resemble and recreate first language acquisition environments. Web 2.0 tools, for their part, carry the promise of enhanced collective learning, interaction, and networking. Their emergence requires that language immersion programs be enriched with these tools so as to expedite even more the language learning process and to make it approximate first language acquisition. The purpose of this paper is to analyze two approaches to language learning based on an extensive review of the literature. The first approach seeks to dissect language immersion programs into 5 key descriptors: goals, actors, beneficiaries, the nature of input and outcomes. The second approach reviews these same descriptors in relation to native language acquisition. This paper is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is dedicated to defining and explicating the practice of language immersion. Part 2 compares and contrasts language immersion and first language acquisition. Part 3 considers the ways in which Web 2.0 can enrich language immersion in a mobile, interactive, and cooperative environment where learners are connected with human and digital resources available within the physical confines of the immersion site and the wider virtual environment. The main conclusion of this paper is that second or foreign language learning is the fastest track to language acquisition, especially with the judicious use and deployment of Web 2.0 tools. Let me now make some comments about the goal of this paper and the problematic that is being raised. We'll start by saying that language immersion for many people around the world, experts and non-experts, is intuitively understood to constitute the best practice in foreign or second language learning. My contention, however, is that our language teaching practices should not just be based on intuitions, practices, and techniques. What I'm arguing is that there is a need to elaborate a theoretical framework. This framework will juxtapose language immersion as best practice with alternative, commonly known theorizations such as, or particularly, first language acquisition. I think that the story of the similarity between language immersion and language acquisition is made more complex through the entry into the education and training market of ICT, or information communication technologies. The problem is that ICT is not a natural development of education. It was rather parachuted into the field. So what I see is that there is a need for understanding, analyzing, and evaluating this sort of deus ex machina, this thing that has hopped into our midst all of a sudden. As Hopin Garner said, our use of technology has to go hand in hand with teaching best practices and theories, and has to be planned in the same way we plan the use of a given textbook for a particular syllabus. So technology is not just something that has to be used at random. It's not something that we have to use just because other people are using it, or because it is the fad or the fashion of the day, or because my colleague in the other room is using all of these fancy tools. It has to be thought out. Any particular gadget or software has to be thought out carefully, and that is why its appearance and its emergence at this time is an invitation for us to think about the best ways to capitalize on its strengths in order to expedite the learning process in an immersion environment. So the goal is for this paper is to demonstrate that language immersion, when enriched with Web 2.0 tools, constitutes the fast track to second language learning after the passing of the critical period. Here are 3 questions that I'll be attempting to answer in this paper, or at least hoping to answer. I am at the intersection of language immersion, language acquisition, and ICT. And the first question that I want to pose is, how and why does language immersion constitute the fastest track to learning after the end of the critical period? Secondly, I would like us to think about ways to theorize the proximity or similarity between the two. And my last question would be to try and imagine or elaborate the contribution of ICT to language immersion. This is a brief definition of immersion. And I'm especially concerned with language immersion, or what some people call language bath. I will not go into a lot of detail trying to explain the difference between full immersion and partial immersion, or early immersion and late immersion, bilingual language immersion, or so-called dual language immersion. But I will just say something about the methodology of immersion. Basically, language immersion teaching means that courses that are normally taught in the target language, in the native language, are now taught in the target language. That is the use of the target language for our learning purposes in the classroom, and I think as well as in daily life. And I'm talking about daily life with a language camp in my mind. Talking about language immersion also brings up the idea of cultural immersion, and the two are very, very solidly related. Because language immersion does not take place in isolation from cultural, social, and daily life frames. For example, teaching courses such as history, education, physical education, art, life sciences, and social sciences requires a lot more than teaching language. And naturally, this teaching spills into the teaching of the target culture and the target language culture as well. Obviously, also language teaching involves pragmatic, social, and cultural dimensions. And it is safe to say that courses that are taught are not islands, but sites in which interdisciplinarity is strongly present. The crux of immersion is when the learner learns the target language whilst immersed in the study of something else, and being immersed in the target language as a medium of interaction and teaching in all aspects of life. Okay, now I'd like to make a few points about the difference between learning and acquisition. Acquisition means that the language learning process starts at birth and continues to develop within the family until the critical period. At that point, at the point of the critical period, the child will have internalized the structures of his or her language, and the foundations of this language, and acquired them in the way native speakers acquire their native languages. The critical period is thus a time window beyond which it will not be possible for the child to learn a second or foreign language in the way of L1 acquisition. This slide here sort of represents really my main contribution in this paper. And here what I'm trying to do is to compare two types of environment: the language immersion environment and then the environment of a child or a baby learning, acquiring his first language. I have chosen to talk about 5 descriptors here, which I will list now, and you can see them on the left-hand column under descriptors. First, I'd like to talk about the goal of intervention for each, for immersion as well as for acquisition. I will also talk about the interveners, that is, the people who intervene in order to create and in order to help with language learning. My third descriptor is the beneficiaries, who is benefiting by this kind of process. My next point of comparison will be the inputs and the nature of learning between the two. And finally, I'm going to look at the intervention outputs, results, or outcomes. What happens at the end of a process of language acquisition versus what happens at the end of the process of an operation such as a language immersion program, a language immersion institute, or camp. Talking about the goal of intervention for the immersion language programs. What is happening here by way of the goal of this intervention is that we have an additional social upbringing, of which learning the target language is one part. So we have a new social upbringing. We are trying to teach the learners a new kind of social fabric and social matrix, along with learning the target language. So the target language on its own is not the only part. That is being taught, but we're talking about learning the target language and learning the social rules and regulations that govern that language. This is for language immersion. For the first language acquisition, the goal is to help the child achieve native social upbringing, of which language acquisition is only one part. So again, even as the child is being reared in the lap of his parents, he or she is not just learning the native language, but also learning the culture that is associated with that language. And you can see from this that there is a large level of similarity between the two. So we're learning something, we're learning a new culture, and we're learning a new language. Who are the interveners? Who are the actors? Who are the makers of this kind of intervention? What the intervener, the kind of framework in which the interveners live is a comprehensive living framework which provides educational and pedagogic support. Here we're talking mainly about the teachers, the facilitators, the people who man and who staff language villages. For language acquisition, we're obviously talking about a family framework, which also provides unconditional support for the learning of the child. So, we now come to the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries refers to a group of people, as far as language immersion is concerned, group of people who are at an age band beyond childhood, and they are motivated to learn the target language. So we're talking about people who may be 6, 7, 12, 14, 15, any age really. So people who have gone beyond the childhood period and who are trying to learn the target language. As far as L1 acquisition is concerned, we're talking about newborns, maybe until the age of 6 or 7 or 12 or however many years are thought to constitute the period preceding the critical period. So these people, these newborns, these children are in the process of learning their L1. Let's now say a few words about the inputs and the nature of learning. And again, I begin with language immersion. The inputs for language immersion are educational programs and curricula with goals, pedagogies, and assessment tools. Insofar as language acquisition is concerned, we're talking about inputs of this nature. The input is permanently random, spontaneous, and interactive. And it is free from formal exercises and tests. So the contrast here between the two is pretty clear. On the one hand, we have pedagogies, we have programs, we have curricula, we have assessment, what have you. It's like sort of a school or a program that is being designed. On the other hand, we have something that is spontaneous, something that is random, input is really free and fluid and non-controlled and just random. Okay, let's now come to the fifth descriptor, and that is the intervention outputs. What is the result? What is the outcome of this of the two types of intervention? For language immersion, we're talking about random and spontaneous inputs, but most importantly, I think we're talking about learning the target language at a level similar to acquisition and in an environment that is somewhat similar to acquisition. Not exactly the same acquisition, but similar to acquisition. For L1 acquisition, we're talking mostly about family, home, and native environment. And so the child will end up learning the language the acquisition way. So, a few points by way of summarizing this table about the comparison between immersion and acquisition. First of all, a distinction is to be made between the beneficiaries in terms of age and cognition. Nonetheless, we are talking about comparable goals. The goal of linguistic and cultural upbringing, which is true for both modes of language learning or language acquisition. Another common point is that we have shared motivation to learn or to acquire among both beneficiaries. Both of them are interested in acquiring language. People who go to language villages or to language institutes are not going there against their will. They are almost always going there because they have a deep desire to learn the language. In the same way, the child also finds that it is in his or her best interest to learn the native language. I think a strong point of comparison between the interveners is that they both they, in both environments, agree on the need to provide the required and unconditional support to achieve the learning process. So parents will provide their support, linguistic, cultural, social, medical, without conditions. And I would like to presume that it is also the case for Language Village, for language immersion interveners, to provide unconditional support for the people who come to learn the language. If you organize a language immersion program and people, students, or anybody at any age comes to you, they are expecting you to provide no less than full, complete, unconditional support for their learning. Therefore, we could say that there is a similarity in the quantity of input and the results of the intervention. If language immersion learners were to continue on the immersion path for 5 years, I would like to think that their acquisition level would be comparable to that achieved, to the level achieved under acquisition. So this is Berthold, 1990. Okay, I'm done with the part where I'm comparing language immersion and language acquisition. So now I will touch briefly on another intersection, which is the configuration of a language immersion village. So in a language immersion village, we're going to assume that there is also that there are these types of inputs, these types of results, these types of interveners, and that the conclusion will be that people are getting closer and closer to an environment where they acquire the language in perhaps a subconscious manner. Let's see how people describe immersion programs. And these immersion programs are obviously inclusive of language and culture. Kaufman, 2009, describes the immersion school as one that carries a very strong linguistic and cultural flavor at the school gate, at the hall, and at every corner of the school. So the texts, the artistic posters, the classrooms, the residence quarters, the employee names, bulletin boards, the name of the school, everything. The school proudly carries the flags of Spanish-speaking countries, and he was referring to a particular school. The target language is used in responding to telephone calls, greeting of visitors, and speaking with the learner's parents using commonly known expressions. Okay, well, what happens when the school is enriched with information communication technologies and the kind of applications made available by Web 2.0 tools? First of all, the main result is that the geographical, physical boundaries of the village are exponentially extended. In a language immersion institute where ICT, which is enriched with ICT, the world is no longer the village itself. The physical the physical walls or partition of the village is no longer what it is. The world itself is the village. At the same time, because we have created this kind of relationship with the world outside the village, we can say that whatever learners in a language immersion program create is now no longer limited to the inhabitants of this language village. What they consume, thanks to social media and virtual reality, is something that comes from all quarters of the world. Thirdly, through contact with the outside world, we're going to have a situation where the volume of transactions among inhabitants is increased. In the past, let's say in the 50s, when there was a language village, people who lived in that language village communicated only with those who are inside, or maybe outside as they go out on a trip or something like this. At this time, we have a situation where the volume of transaction is not just between people inside the village, but with everybody else in any part of the world. Because of this opening, because of what has been made available through the applications of social media, the number of people who can intervene in the learning process or the acquisition process or the immersion process, if you want to call it, has increased increased a lot. In the end, I think we have sort of a 360 degrees immersion program. We're talking about permanent learning, ubiquitous learning, mobile learning, learning 360 degrees. And also, because of the interactive technology, learning is both individual and collective. It was always the case that learning was individual and collective, but now it is more so, and the chances for collective acquisition or acquisitions that are bolstered by the existence or by life within the community have become more and more numerous. Last point is that formal learning programs are now buttressed by spontaneous acquisition. And this is perhaps the very crux of the matter here. Foreign language learning is a situation where people are following certain programs and they meet, let's say, 3 hours a week in order to talk about the passive voice, to talk about how to buy a stamp, how to seek how to seek directions in a language learning in an immersion environment. It's no longer exactly organized in this manner. Learning is taking place all the time, and the kind of transactions between people living in the village is no longer and necessarily confined to formal transactions, but there is a lot of spontaneity in this. And again, this is reminiscent of language acquisition. I'd like to conclude this talk by making the following points. First of all, as we have seen, it seems that we're facing a difficulty of classifying immersion as pure acquisition. Very clearly, immersion is not acquisition. We're not talking about children. We're not talking about newborns. We're talking about people who have already gained the first language and are acquiring a second language. So it's not acquisition in a pure sense. However, the elements of comparison are many, and they differ significantly from second language learning environments. So I'd like for this to be something that we think about. I'd like us to think about creating deep level theorizations of such immersion contexts. What do they really signify? And the reason I say this is that historically there has not been a lot of theorization of language immersion programs. They have been described. We know what they consist in. We can demonstrate or show you the kinds of syllabi that they follow. We can take pictures of what happens inside pictures or video of what happens inside the schools. But immersion itself has not been deeply and adequately theorized. So that is my call. On the practical side, I would like us to think about designing and implementing a language immersion program. When this happens, I'd like that this program be subjected to examination and assessment in order to verify its viability and feasibility, and to make a more principled and theoretically grounded statement on this affinity between the two. I think with this I will end. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm afraid I'm not available at this time for a Q&A session. I wish it were the case, but it simply isn't. So from me, Ali Hashmi Raddaoui at the University of Wyoming, thank you very much for listening and hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you.